Welcome to Cybersecurity from Scratch, Technical Foundations, Episode 14, Persistence on Windows Hosts. This episode is going to focus on some of the basic strategies that red teamers will use to get back into a network once they've obtained initial access. The basic strategies are adding new users, auto-starting programs, aka malware, and scheduling tasks. Let's do a quick refresh of what persistence means in terms of the red team attack chain. The red team will establish a foothold somehow with an exploit or a social engineering attack, and often these footholds are rather complicated and expensive to obtain, and sometimes it's impractical or flat out impossible to do the same thing twice. The idea behind persistence is the red team is able to stay in the system after they've obtained that foothold without replicating the steps that they had to originally take. Essentially, the idea is once they get in, they want to stay in or be able to get back in with a minimum amount of effort. To level set expectations, I want to talk about the scope of this video. We're focusing here on the very basic techniques that pen testers and bad actors will use. The idea here is that most threat actors are going to try something like this, as the largest volume of them are not really all that sophisticated. Like most people who are trying to hack just don't know all that much about what they're doing. They're just sort of trying things out. It's just the same as any profession. Like there's a lot of people who are just starting out, there's a lot of people who are kind of mediocre, and there's a handful of people who are highly elite. And in practice, these techniques are going to show you what to worry about for the vast majority of attacks, but again, we'll have to get into later some of the more elite stuff. For now, these are the basic bases that need to be covered. An attacker will try to get access to a user's credentials so they can log in again, often using a remote desktop. Now, a lot of times they're not going to have the credentials of whatever account they compromised, because whether it's social engineering or an exploit or something like that, a host is really good about not exposing its password. And so a lot of times the attacker is running in an admin shell, but they don't have an admin password. So one of the easy ways to get around that is with admin. You can create a new user, give it admin, and allow it to remote in. So the first step here is turning on remote desktop if it's not already there, and the attacker will use the registry key shown on the right to do that. The attacker can use the net command to add a user and then to make it an administrator. And then finally they'll try to make it a member of remote desktop users to allow it to use remote desktop. It's important to note that if you're on Windows 10 Home, you're not going to be able to do that because that feature just isn't available for you, and you're going to see an error like the one on the right hand side of the screen. That group can't exist. And then finally, the attacker is going to open the firewall. This is going to vary depending on what the firewall looks like, but if it's a Windows 10 system, it's going to have the basic Windows Defender firewall just from scratch, but there's also the possibility of having some other endpoint products that will keep that port blocked. Another technique that can be used is to set up the system to start a program when the user logs in. And often this will be a malware or a legitimate executable which has been compromised in some way. So what can happen is the user will set the HKey current user software, Microsoft Windows current version run registry key, and add a value for whatever program that they want to run. So you can see in this example here, Discord, OneDrive, and Steam will start up for this user on login. Here's an example where a system has been set up to launch the calculator on user login with the registry command shown on the left. Now, in this case, this is a harmless example. However, had calc.exe been substituted for something malicious, then, well, you got malware launching on user login. It turns out there's actually many registry keys which can be used to launch programs. I've included a link here, and it will be in the episode description to have a more exhaustive list. There's two levels of keys, HKeyCU for the keys applying to the current user, and HKLM for keys which apply to the entire local machine. With the same strategy, an attacker can also simply drop a program in the startup folder for a particular user and not have to touch a registry key. It does pretty much the exact same thing, the effect is the same, but it's just a little bit different. You just move a file around. So for every user, there is a app data, Microsoft Windows, start menu, programs, startup folder, and just kind of drop a file in there and it'll start up on its own. The last strategy we'll talk about is scheduling a task. Basically what we're doing is telling Windows that at a particular time or at a particular interval, You're going to kick off some executable and run some command as a particular user with a particular password, and that's how an attacker can get their malware launched. This can be nice from the red team perspective because it's a lot easier to bury a task in a whole pile of other tasks, especially if that particular set of tasks isn't managed all that well. The rather arcane syntax over on the right is used to set up that task, so you can parse that or just Google for your own. Now, something to note is that when you're setting up tasks, the user has to have the right privileges, and I've included a link there which is going to go into detail on how to set up a user with the appropriate privileges. This can limit a red team engagement because if those privileges aren't set and the user doesn't have the rights to create that particular set of permissions on the target user, then this vector is blocked. The task just won't start. Now let's talk about mitigations. So in this case, we have some of the strongest mitigations available. All of these techniques that we've looked at so far are fairly basic, and so they can be countered quite reliably by blue team tactics. The short answer, though, is auditing. The user account creation method is the easiest to counter. It's fairly easy to set up windows to log every user account that's created, and then what you can do is have your Security Operations Center simply correlate those logs against new user requests. And this can even be automated fairly easily as long as you have some sort of process that submits forms for new user account creation. If you find one that's not in the list, then bam, you have a red flag and you go investigate that. So the good thing is, once you have this set up, it requires relatively little effort to keep it going and make sure that the maintenance and the monitoring is in place. Now, should a user account be created, we can also defend against the actual remote desktop attempt. Now, we have to assume that if the particular host is compromised, the local firewall is taken down, but if we can use a network level firewall, that provides a second level of protection, so that even if a new local account is created, the firewall will still stop something from getting in from the network. That doesn't help you if you're using remote desktop as a normal part of your concept of operations, but if it's available, then that's a great way to cut things off. Now, for the registry keys that allow automatic startup and write access to the startup folder, Windows Defender quite correctly will let these values be written, because that's just a normal part of setting up a system, is allowing programs to start on automatic launch. It's normal, it's a healthy part of the normal workflow. However, it can be monitored with some supplemental monitoring in a way that can fairly accurately find deviations. Assuming there's something even remotely close to an organizational baseline, you can flag any writes to these directories or any writes to those particular registry keys and have them reviewed. In a perfect world, your environment has a known set of configurations and you can audit automatically and precisely what these are. Even without an automatic audit of these things, usually you're not going to have so many systems writing to this location that you can't have someone review these logs. It's a lot, but it's not unattainable either, unless you have, essentially no monitoring budget and a very large number of systems. But it's something that can be done. Scheduled tasks are kind of hard to audit because you're creating tasks and tearing them down all the time as part of your normal business rhythm. Now, in a perfect world, there's enough configuration lockdown that at the very least, users are documenting when they set up these tasks and documenting when they tear them back down again, so that there's something that's written down that can be audited. But still, this is usually impractical to do from a perspective of doing an automated script, unless you have a whole lot of metadata in your work tracking system. I've seen it done, but it requires a lot of overhead, and frankly, depending on the security level of the environment, it might not be worth it. Of course, if anybody can schedule anything for any reason and they never have to write down what they're doing, humans have to sort of read through the sets of scheduled tasks, and honestly, that's kind of a nightmare. So of the ways to audit this, really the best way to do it is to have some sort of work management system that has schema built in so that users are documenting when they're setting up scheduled tasks, and then you have an automated system checking the logs against that system. Harder to do, you definitely have to be deliberate in your schema setup, but it's attainable. Of course, it might not be worth it depending on your security level, but that's a decision for the organization. Our next episode is going to be looking at the exact same thing, except on Linux. What are the Linux-specific things that attackers will use to persist on the host?